Hello and welcome to this week's bonus episode of Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. This week I spoke with Asher Miller. Asher is the CEO of Post Carbon Institute, which is a think tank which has been tackling the climate crisis since 2003 from a systems perspective. Now, what that means is understanding the intersection between energy, economy, and ecology. It means, as Asher says, telling the truth, telling the full picture, the big picture, not shying away from the reality that we face, which is extremely difficult. The thing that I want to touch on in this bonus episode is what Asher and I discuss, I think, around the halfway mark, which is the question, can you pull down the master's house with the master's tools? So what we mean by that is, can you use the tools of the system that are currently in place to destroy that system and effectively build a new and better one? Or by the very acts of using those master's tools, are you limiting whatever comes next to be a reproduction or similar to the very thing that you're trying to destroy or change? It's a hell of a question. Before better understanding systems, I was firmly in the camp of no, you cannot use the tools of the system that you're trying to destroy in order to destroy it, because it means that you will limit whatever comes next to be a replication, a shadow form, if you will. I think it's often why we see in leftist revolutions the violence that is necessary to revolt and the years of terror that follow. And then in order to build a better state, but the state is often a shadow or very, very similar to what came before. That which was celebrated before becomes hidden. Russia and France are really, really good examples. So they got rid of their ruling class, essentially, which was built on huge economic inequality. But those economic inequalities remain today embedded in the system. It's just rather than celebrating those oligarchs or the bourgeoisie, they have had to create frameworks and systems that enable them to still continue that life, but more in the shadow realm, more in the shadows. However, coming from a systems perspective, I think what happens is, because you need a diverse approach to solving a problem like the climate crisis, and you need multiple things happening at the same time, converging together and interacting together to create something that's equally complex as the world that we live in, and also to battle the complexities of the world that we live in, then I think maybe what's happened in the past is that we have failed to understand that the tools that we use at the beginning cannot be the tools that we then continue to use. So you can tear down the master's house maybe with the master's tools, but then if you're going to rebuild, you definitely have to use something else. And I think that that ties into what we know about the beginning stage of systems, so that explosive growth. For that explosion to happen, perhaps it would be violent, typically is. But then to reach a period of stasis, it's a very, very different. I mean, even if you look at ecosystems, like how ecosystems create and use energy during a period of stasis versus explosive growth is extremely different. And I think what happens is we get stuck in explosive growth, don't quite not know what to do with all of that energy, which then devolves into violence. And then rather than getting into the complexities of whatever it is that we are trying to build, we end up throwing up, a mirror image of what came before, another oligarchy and another form of capitalism. The more and more I do these interviews, the more and more I think about the diverse ecosystem of solutions that needs to be in place, and that we need to have more conversations about the fact that, how do I say this without being abstract? The tools that were used at one stage of this process, for example, highlighting the urgency of our situation. So Extinction Rebellion did a fantastic job of bringing attention to the climate crisis by their protests, nonviolent protests, but huge protests nonetheless, climbing on top of tubes and blocking off roads and generally being, a huge pain in the ass to public and to industry. They did an amazing job. However, now the attention has been drawn, the urgency has been highlighted. Most people are actually genuinely aware of it. It's just that most people don't have time to think about it. So now the tactic has to change. So perhaps that tactic can be used in other parts of the world where attention has not been drawn to the climate crisis. But now, certainly in places like the UK, we need to be thinking about different tools for this next stage, which is dismantling and creating at the same time. We're past the point of just relying on slogans. And I think often what stops the environmental movement advancing is people go, well, what are your policies though? Like, what do you actually want to implement? And how do we get there? The next thing is probably more activists going into politics, having a mandate, asking people to vote for them. Activism is so inherently anti-establishment. I can imagine and understand why that would be very, very difficult for many people to sort of dance with the devil that they've been trying to warn against. But effective change has to be multi-directional. It can start from the outside, but at one point it has to enter in and start tinkering with the very nature of the thing that you're trying to change. To exist purely in contrast to something means that all of the energy in both movements, say a government and a social movement, go into the relationship between those two things, the relationship between the movement and the government, rather than going into changing, adapting, evolving the government or whatever establishment it is that you're trying to change. This is actually why I feel really sorry for Greta, and I worry about the environmental movement, because it is not she's not a child anymore, but it is not a child's responsibility to lead a movement. And frankly, her school strike was something that, again, drew attention to the problem, but it cannot be the basis of all action going forward. It needs to be part of an ecosystem of deliverable actions that different people can take depending on what their situation is, depending on what they have access to, and only by hitting all of those leverage points at the same time are we actually going to enable change. If you want to make a resilient system, like, the multiplicity and the diversity of that system is key to its own survival as well. And that, I think, is something we're forgetting. So how do you create an ecosystem of solutions without it being ideological? Because the thing is, when a system or when a movement becomes ideological, then people get upset if things are done differently in different chapters. And is using the master's tools to tear down the master's house part of that ecosystem of solutions? I'd love to know what you think about this. Leave a comment below. And also, if anybody's done any research on this or knows any research on this, please drop the name of the researcher, not the link. Otherwise, YouTube will delete the comment. Also, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button for a weekly podcast episode and a weekly bonus episode. If you're a long-time listener and you're really enjoying the show, support Planet Critical on Patreon. The entire project is supported by the community of listeners. So if you want to be a part of that community, the link is also in the description box below. To my patrons and supporters, a huge thank you for making this work possible. All right, everyone, thank you all for watching. I hope this was valuable, and I'll see you next week.